Okay, we'll be careful. Good evening, everybody. We are here to remember Professor Ken Raj, who is the principal founder of this center. And we are happy that we have today Professor Premachandra Athukorala, who, as you know, he has been here for some time. So I suppose most of you know you.
Yeah,
Most of them know you.
I have a lot of friends.
You have made a lot of friends, and that also speaks for your personality. But I have the responsibility of formally introducing Professor Athukorala. Professor Athukorala is Professor of Economics in Ant Gordon Department of Economics, College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. He is also a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and Honorary Professorial Research Fellow at the University of Manchester. He has a long academic career, distinguished academic career, and if I may mention some of them, his publications include Trade Policy Issues in Asian Development, Structural Adjustment and Labor Migration in East Asia. These are his books. Liberalization, Industrial Adjustment, Sri Lanka in International Perspective, Saving, Investment and Growth in India, Crisis and Recovery in Malaysia, the Role of Capital Controls, Multinational Enterprises in Asian Development, and the Rise of Asia, that was published in 2010. He has a number of books edited, as well as a number of research papers. I don't have to elaborate on them. He's on the editorial boards of Asia Economic Papers, as well as Asian Development Review, and also Asia Pacific Economic Literature. He has also been a consultant to various international organizations. I think thereby he was fortunate to have a wide-ranging experience of countries and the functioning of those economies, so as to write so many of the books that I mentioned. I was asking him about is he a Sri Lankan or an Australian? So he said, by citizenship, I am a Sri Lankan, but he has deep connections, as you can imagine, with Sri Lanka, where his family roots are. When you talk about Ken Raj or remember Ken Raj, Sri Lanka is special. Not many of you know that Raj was very fond of Sri Lanka. And I asked him once, because he, in one of the informal conversations during his really old age, he talked about the persons that he knew from Sri Lanka. He said, my first job was in Sri Lanka. When he returned from the London School of Economics in 1947, he went straight to Delhi to meet Professor V.K.R.V. Rao, who had met him in Cambridge. LSE was in Cambridge at that time, because Dr. Rao wanted Ken Raj to come and join the newly started Delhi School of Economics. When Dr. Raj met him, he was not very excited because he said, we haven't got the money from Government of India to create new positions, so you will have to wait for some time. So he returned to Kerala, to his family. At that time, they were located in Thrissur. And he had the habit of reading the Times of India newspaper. And one of it, he found an advertisement for an assistant editor in the Ceylon Times at that time.
Daily News.
Oh, yes, the Ceylon Daily News.
Yes.
So he told me one of his friends, I think it was Lal Jayavardhane, who might have been his batchmate or classmate in London School of Economics. And he straight away went to Colombo as an assistant editor. The reason why I asked him about his Sri Lanka connection is that he was a very busy man when he was at work here. Jose knows, I know. So when I gave him a manuscript, actually most of the manuscript he wouldn't read the whole thing. He will read for the first 2-3 pages and then he will understand what is it. So in one of my manuscripts, he made such editorial corrections. A comma here, a colon here, or a semicolon here, and a fitting word here and there. So when he returned this to me, I said, you have edited this paper, although it's only the first page, I will have to do a lot more. He said, I was a journalist. And we were very particular that the matter before it goes to the press had to be properly edited for language and all such reasons. In 1987, I had an occasion to visit Colombo. That was because when I was coming back after my PhD, Dr. Raj asked me to come via Geneva to meet one of the officials in the ILO, because they had asked Mr. Gopinath at that time. He was heading the International Institute for Labor Studies, and he wanted whether we could do a study comparing Kerala and Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. So I went there. Gopinath instructed me how to go about it and came back. I went to Sri Lanka. That project didn't fruition for some technical reasons. The ILO was not very keen to fund it later. I met Professor W.D. Lakshman, and I hear from Professor Athukorala that he was your teacher, your guru. So I have the privilege of knowing Professor Lakshman, who was his guru. And of course, when you go to Sri Lanka, when you go from Kerala to Sri Lanka, you don't feel you are in a foreign country. The ecology is the same. The people look like all of us. We are the same. And the food is very similar, not to speak of the heavy rains. I also met at that time Lal Jayavardhane's wife, but a distinguished economist, and later a very leading feminist economist, Kumari Jayavardhane. She's still alive. She's still alive, I know. She's 95 or something like that. Around that. Yes. But Lal passed away. Lal passed away, and it was fascinating to have a discussion with her, Kumari Jayavardhane. That one of the reasons was that I had consulted her PhD thesis, which I found in the library of the London School of Economics. It's called The Rise of Labour in Ceylon. And it was fascinating to read the chapters in which she said, much of the trade union activity in Colombo started by Malayalis who came from Kerala, organizing the bullock cart drivers, the tree climbers, the plantation workers, the shop assistants, and all conceivable sections of workers as they did in Kerala. So these are some of the thoughts that comes to mind. But I also want to emphasize the point, as a last point. Despite all these connections, historical linkages, we don't have as much academic linkages, academic exchanges with our neighboring countries, including Sri Lanka, as we should have. We are more connected to American and Western European universities and academics than with our own academics in the region. And that's a sad state of affairs, because there are so many problems which are so similar. And we need to understand better why the same things happen here, there, and everywhere in South Asia. and our perspectives would be much better than a very specific nation-centered approach. I hope that will change, and some of you will take the lead in going around these countries and learn more from them. I would now request Professor Athukorala to deliver his Raj lecture.
Replace it.
We'll be using a PPT, no?
Yeah. Thank you. I read it better. Yes, sir. Isn't it? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kannan, for the nice introduction. As you felt in 87 in Sri Lanka, you could see in difference. We feel the same in Kerala. Actually, we are basically the same people, same cultural roots. Professor Kannan, Professor Veeramani, members of the academic staff here, and others in the audience. Most of them are already our friends. Yeah, and of course, I forgot to mention Mr. Gopal Raj, the great son of Professor Ken Raj. It's a great honor and privilege to see you in this audience. I feel deeply honored to pay tribute to Professor Kakkadan Nandanath Raj, Ken Raj, a scholar whose work has profoundly shaped development thinking. I will not visit his illustrious career, which you know far better than I do. There is no need to carry calls to Newcastle. But I would be remiss if I did not briefly highlight his connection to my own country, Sri Lanka. As Professor Kannan mentioned, after completing his PhD at London School of Economics in 1945 at the tender age of 24, which is an amazing achievement, his first job was as an assistant editor of Sri Lanka's leading newspaper, the Daily News. He was there for 9 months, from November 1947 to July 1948, before moving to Delhi School of Economics. 2 decades later, in 1971, he served as a member of a landmark International Labour Organization mission to Sri Lanka, led by Professor Dudley Sears, under the newly set up World Employment Program of the ILO. That mission produced an influential report entitled Matching Employment Opportunities and Expectation, a Program of Action for Ceylon, a 2-volume policy report, which spawned a series of similar ILO studies in other countries. Professor Raj contributed the chapter in the report on employment generation potential of Sri Lankan agriculture in that report. He subsequently contributed, combined what he learned in Sri Lanka with his extensive knowledge in Indian agriculture to write an influential paper entitled Mechanization of Agriculture in Ceylon and India, which was appeared in International Labour Review in 1972. Therefore, his link to my home country is very strong, and it has contributed a lot to the knowledge base of our own country. It gives me great pride to celebrate Professor Raj's ties to Sri Lanka and to honor his legacy through this memorial lecture. This afternoon, I focus my lecture on the sovereign debt crisis in Sri Lanka, which has attracted much international attention in recent years as a major economic upheaval in the developing world. As most of you know, Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon, achieved independence in 1948 with high hopes for economic development. It doesn't move. Yeah. Yes, that's right. They said. Sri Lanka achieved independence in 1948 with high hope for economic development. When he was interviewed by a Newsweek journalist in 1948, our first Prime Minister proudly said, "We want neither grants nor loans from the United States or any other country." And Sri Lanka was awash with foreign reserves at that time. It was a very affluent country. However, today, Sri Lanka stands as the first Asian country in more than 6 decades to default on its sovereign debt. The previous instance was Burma in early 1960. No other country has defaulted sovereign debt since then. And Sri Lanka in that way has put a record. And currently, the country is undergoing painful structural stabilization reform under the tutelage of IMF. And this tragic transition from great expectations to a needy state holds important lessons for development policy debate. Now, my lecture, I believe, may make 2 important contributions to the literature. Firstly, it deepened the understanding of Sri Lanka's post-independent development failure or tragedy, and to help identify path forward for beyond the crisis. As some of you know, Chinese word for crisis has 2 characters. One represents danger, the other represents opportunity. Crisis is always an opportunity to look at what went wrong and then design the way forward. That is my first objective. The second objective is to contribute to the post-COVID-19 policy debate on emerging market sovereign debt crisis from the experience of Sri Lanka. Many prominent economists have already started writing, including Kaushik Basu and many others, about Sri Lankan crisis, not for the sake of guiding Sri Lanka, but also to learn more about third world debt crisis. I have two quotations here. The first quotation is from the boss of IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. She says Sri Lanka is a warning sign for policy strains faced by countries with high debt levels and limited policy choice. It's a classic case of a country which had limited policy choice, mainly because of a huge public debt overhang. Secondly, Anne Kruger says Sri Lanka is an illustrative case of how postponing a reckoning through various peaceful measures will make matters worse in the end. Now, therefore, Sri Lankan story has relevance beyond Sri Lanka's borders. This is the way I'm going to structure my lecture. We need firstly look at the historical context to understand the crisis. Then I'm going to discuss how Sri Lanka turned out to be vulnerable to the crisis. In Sri Lanka, in Asia, Sri Lanka is the only country which succumbed to the debt crisis in the aftermath of the COVID. Then I'm going to explain the vulnerability that led to the crisis. Then I explained briefly the onset of the crisis, policy modeling through, and finally going to the IMF. Then IMF program and policy challenge beyond the IMF program, and then few concluding remarks. Historical context. A fuller understanding of the crisis and formulation of effective policy require a historical perspective. Many people who have written about Sri Lankan crisis reminds me the great Indian proverb about 7 blind people try to identify the elephant. One blind man touching the trunk said that it's like a dust or something, right? Like 7 came up with different stories with the elephant. Most what people have written so far resembles that parable. As John Maynard Keynes famously said in his well-known obituary of Alfred Marshall, we must study the present in the light of the past for the purpose of the future. History is the foundation for economic thinking. Now, let me begin with the colonial inheritance. This quotation from a well-known British historian. Ceylon was the model colony well prepared for self-governance in terms of political progress as well as economic development. It was the colony next, the other colonies which were next in line to achieve independence, for instance, Gold Coast, Ghana, and Malaysia were at least generation away from the ability to self-govern the country. That was the strength of Sri Lanka at that same time. What are the structural features which led to that statement? Firstly, the country had an open economy with a buoyant export sector evolved over more than 100 years. Strong balance of payment position, as I quoted before, the country was awash with foreign exchange, and then relatively well-developed economic and social infrastructure, nice road network built across the country, then efficient administrative apparatus staffed largely by locals. Then relatively good standard of education, literacy rate was comparable to that in Japan at the time. Public health was widely available even at the village level at that time, and people were generally well fed. And it was, in fact, a fledgling welfare state. That's the unique feature of Ceylon as a colony. British started free education, public health, and all these things well before independence was given to the country. And then finally, an ideal geographic position for globally integrated development. Lee Kuan Yew, when he went to Cambridge as a student, he had to go via Colombo. Singapore was not a travel center at that time. Travel center in the region was Sri Lanka. Overall, the expectation was that Sri Lanka would prove to be the best bet among all post-colonial nations in Asia. But it did not happen. Then what is the story of missed opportunities? I don't have time to go into detail. I have summarized Sri Lankan history in 7 slides here. You can look at it later. This is the fundamental development issue in Sri Lanka. Now, the British started the welfare state. Then the post-independent governance started expanding the welfare state because it was basically a vote winner, right? The people like expanding free education, health system. I mean, I'm not saying it is bad. Actually, Sri Lanka could have maintained the welfare state, built on it as part of a thriving export-oriented economy, which did not happen. That is the big issue. The successive government failed to match the welfare orientation with a coherent strategy to find new source of growth through global economic integration. The colony thrived as a trading nation. But after independence, Sri Lanka turned out to be more and more inward-oriented for about 3 decades. Then reform started in 1977, as I have listed in other slide, but reform did not work fully, even though there were positive gains from the reform. Firstly, because of the ethnic uprising, which was there for 2.5 decades. Then reforms were half-hearted. All these things contributed to lackluster outcome of reform. And then, without going into detail, I'm going to summarize the tragic story. Yeah. In the 7 decades since independence, Sri Lankan economy experienced uneven and intermittent growth, not sustained growth. Actually, the average growth rate was about 4%. If the economy grew at 4% consistent level path, actually Sri Lanka would have become an upper middle income country by about early 90s, if you do the calculation. But growth was stop-go type. So in some years, positive growth, but then negative growth and so on. If you graph growth rates for many countries, you would not see a pattern like this for most of the countries in Asia and beyond. And then because of this growth pattern, Sri Lanka lagged behind dynamic Asian economies. When Sri Lanka achieved independence around 1950 here, our per capita income, these are measures relative to the US, right? In order to ensure comparison, individual countries' data have been expressed as a percentage of US. Now, Korean per capita income was about 8% of US, but Sri Lanka was 11%. We were ahead of Korea. We were ahead of Thailand. We were closer to Malaysia during that period. And then look at what happened over the time. Singapore, actually Lee Kuan Yew in 1953 said that he wanted to bring the living standard of Singapore to the level of Sri Lanka. Now look at Singapore per capita income is 175% of US per capita income. And then even Thailand, Malaysia, all these countries have bypassed Sri Lanka. In other words, initially we were in the East Asian League, not in South Asian League. But over time, we have converged to the low growth South Asian League in the growth ranking. Then poor growth record was underpinned by twin deficit. Now, when you want to tell the growth story, you need the macroeconomic side. The best indicators would be the budget deficit and the trade balance of payment deficit moved. During the period covered here from 1959 to 2019, Sri Lanka had current account surpluses only in 2 years. You can see here. I need your help. Yeah, that's okay. I think it's not very important. There were current account surpluses only 2 years.
This one.
Yeah. Yes. And then you can see these were the current account surpluses. In all years, Sri Lanka have deficits. At the same time, budget situation was a mirror image of the current account situation. There was only budget surpluses only in 1 year. Throughout the period, budget was in deficit, right? It simply reflects the fact that on the one hand, inability to diversify the economy from traditional export sectors contributed significantly to the balance of payment situation. At the same time, economy was not growing fast, but tax base was very narrow and all that. Then in order to maintain the welfare record, which was politically very appealing, government had to borrow or create money. And then because of that reason, the government hands were tied when it comes to other development programs during that period. Now, outcome of that situation, the persistent twin deficit situation in the country was that reserves depleted dramatically. When Ms. Senanayake made that statement, we were something like that. The country had enough foreign reserves without creating any export earning to meet the requirement of 12 months ahead, right? The number of months of import equivalent of foreign reserves was very high. But then situation changed gradually, and foreign reserve levels turned out to be very low throughout this period. And then as the foreign reserves depleted, deficits were filled mostly through import restrictions and concessionary foreign financing during the period from 1960 to 1977, at least cartographical error in that over here, that 77 for about 2.5 decades, the economy remained closed with huge import restrictions and then depending on consumption rate. Then the economy was liberalized in 1977 to a certain extent, and then import restrictions went away. Then the government depended on concessionary aid and grants turned out to be even bigger during that period. Now, we had a twin deficit situation, lack of foreign reserves. Therefore, when the economy is affected by various economic shocks from time to time, Sri Lanka did not have other alternative than turn into the IMF. In other words, Sri Lanka turned out to be a repetitive client of the IMF during the post-independence period. Until the present agreement, Sri Lanka had signed 16 agreements with the IMF. I think no country in Asia has done this, right? Other than perhaps Pakistan, which is not a star performer, right? They compare to. Then this is the present extended fund facility, which was signed in March 2023, which was the highest. Now, from the viewpoint of this lecture, it is very important to understand that this IMF agreement is different from all the 16s. I'm going to explain it. The crisis that led to the 17th IMF program is unique in the country's post-independence era. Previous crises were simply liquidity crises, which did not involve massive accumulated debt because we relied on grants and debt, but they were low interest borrowings or grants. Therefore, debt servicing burden was not huge during that period, even though we were dependent on foreign aid. After achieving a relaxed current account position with IMF support, the government had the freedom to revert to the old fiscal and monetary profligacy. When you study all these 16 crises, then you can see during the crisis period, country was very obedient to IMF. Then when the IMF left, they start again the old practices. Then the next crisis come. That's how the country become a repetitive client of the IMF. This time is different. The country is facing a solvency crisis. I think most of you know the difference between a liquidity crisis and a solvency crisis, because there is a danger of country becoming insolvent now, not in the previous year, not merely a temporary liquidity shortage like in the previous cases, but a massive debt overhang. Even after macroeconomic stability restored with the IMF package program, the country will still need to service a large and persistent debt overhang. When the IMF agreement ended in 2027, country had to service $60 billion of foreign debt, prepay and interest pay on that debt. Therefore, hands were tied relating to development objective. Therefore, the difference between liquidity crisis and solvency crisis is central to my story. Then I'm moving to the next section to explain why this happened. To give discipline to the data, you need little bit theory, right? I'm going to explain the relevant theory in one paragraph slide, and then move to the prognosis to identify the cost of the problem. Now, brief theory, it is a summary from a paper I wrote in 2002 with my colleague Peter Wu. Now, a sovereign debt crisis or any major financial crisis typically results from the interaction of two elements. The first element is vulnerability. The second element is trigger. Right? Vulnerability is basically a situation where underlying economic fundamental economic conditions are unsustainable. Development of unsustainable macroeconomic situation. That means a vulnerable situation of the country. The great open economy, macroeconomy, the late Rudiger Dornbusch has put it nicely. Vulnerability means that if something goes wrong, then suddenly a lot goes wrong. A situation like this. Then the trigger is a sudden event or a shock that transform vulnerable situation into a full-scale crisis. Then the trigger can be global recession or a pandemic. In our case, it was a pandemic. Sudden shift of capital flows, a major policy mistake done by a country, like in the Great Depression, US tariff case, a collapse of a key firm or a bank. Now, think about situation like this. COVID spread all over the world, right? But only Sri Lanka succumbed to the COVID crisis, debt crisis, simply because other countries' economic fundamentals were not vulnerable, made the country vulnerable to the crisis. Sri Lanka had a vulnerable macroeconomic situation. When this trigger happened, the two things combined to create a crisis. Think about a country. In this country, say in Kerala, many people succumb to the coronavirus, but not all, right? Some people were immune to the virus, others were not immune to the crisis. Therefore, when we study a crisis, situation is similar. Crisis, say, vulnerable situation will lead to a crisis someday, but you can't tell the time, right? The country remain vulnerable. When a trigger happened, it turned out to be a crisis. Then I'm going to explain come up with a prognosis of the vulnerability to the crisis. It is difficult to clearly demarcate the point of departure from the old practice, but development of vulnerability in the Sri Lankan economy started with Mahinda Rajapaksa coming into power as president in 2005. Now, as I mentioned before, policymakers had realized the deep-rooted problem in the economy and started some reform in 77. But the reform didn't work very well because of the factors I mentioned, but still there were clear signs that this is the way to go in the country. But under Mr. Rajapaksa, there was a dramatic reversal in policy from that correct path. A new development strategy called a new vision for achieving balanced growth, emphasizing the role of a state in guiding the market. That was his slogan. The market-oriented reforms will not work. Government has to come into the picture and guide the development path. Then there was a backlash against initial liberalization reform during that period. There was, on the other hand, emphasis on massive infrastructure development through using borrowed money at very high rate. Of course, after the civil war, there was a need to restore infrastructure in the country, to build the road network to Kandy with the Jaffna area, which had been destroyed, and so on. But ignoring the overall macroeconomic situation, the entire focus was on infrastructure development because it had some added advantage. It creates opportunities to support your cronies or family members. That's the very interesting aspect of infrastructure project, right? A friend of mine working at ADB told me that the South Road in Sri Lanka could have been paved with gold with that money. I don't know what it means, right? Then, because of this infrastructure boom, There was massive economic growth during that period. During the first regime, there was growth rate of 9% over here, historically high levels, right? And then growth movement remained historically high during that period, but it was temporary. Then the growth spurt was underpinned by a massive anti-tradable bias. The economic structure has been shifting from tradable production, that means competitive import substitution and export-oriented industries, to services, government services, infrastructure development, and so on. There is no single indicator of anti-tradable bias, but I have reported two indicators here. One is export share in GDP, total good and services export as a percentage of GDP, which declined dramatically during that period. Say, earlier export amounted to about 37% of GDP, and it plummeted to about 15% during that period. Now, the second indicator is a rough indicator of tradable production in GDP as a percentage of total GDP. Tradable production here is basically manufacturing and agricultural production. There can be limitation in that index, but both indicate the dramatic shift in the economy towards non-tradable. Now think about the situation. Country was borrowing massively, but the economy was not prepared to meet that debt burden, because the growth spurt had come mainly from non-tradable production. This is just a note about the concept. You can look at it. Then sources of anti-tradable bias. Briefly, when money is injected to construction and other sectors which are non-tradable, naturally the incentive structure shift against tradable production, right? Wage levels increase in construction industries, workers move to that section, and then the tradable production suffer. At the same time, the policy mix added to the anti-tradable bias through other policies in the policy mix. For instance, foreign direct investment policy turned out to be very distorted during that period. And the president's brother, who was the economic minister, turned out to be what you call it, 10 to 20% man, charging for investors coming into the country and all sort of things. Investment really dried out during that period, export-oriented investment. At the same time, when political supporters come and talk to him, manufacturers, he will increase their import duties in order to protect their industries. Therefore, trade policy regime turned out to be highly distorted. All these things turn out to be created and massive anti-export bias in the economy. All of you know the standard learner symmetry theorem. Professor Veeramani explained it, I remember, in the lecture recently. When import competing industries are protected through government measures, it eventually turns out to be a tax on exporters. Therefore, all these things contributed to the massive decline in export to GDP ratio during that period. Now, then the growth process was non-tradable bias. At the same time, that process was based on a massive debt buildup, as this diagram indicates. The debt level increased dramatically during that period. Foreign debt increased at a rapid rate compared to domestic debt as well. Remember, during this period, debt was high, but these debts were concessionary foreign aid. Therefore, and they went mostly to tradable production. There was a massive river valley development project which promoted agricultural production. Then there was a project to promote export-oriented industries by setting up free trade zones. They contributed export orientation in the economy. But this debt buildup was basically not supported by a structural change in the economy to make it possible for the country to bear the debt burden in the future. Now, this is the standard indicator. I think most of the students know here. The IMF and World Bank and generally people used to measure debt dependence, right? Debt as a percentage of GDP. Now, I'm writing a paper about the limitation of this indicator. Think about Sri Lanka, where the debt contributed to expansion of the economy through non-tradable. Non-tradable does not enable for it to repay debt, right? And therefore, if you use GDP as the denominator to measure that burden, it is going to give a distorted picture. The two better indicators are reported here. One is debt relative to export. Exports are definitely creating ability to meet foreign debt. Right? The other one is debt to tradable production. Tradable production means efficient import competition, competitive industries and export-oriented industries. When you look at that to these two fundamentally important indicators, you can see the picture change dramatically during that period. Debt to export ratio, external debt to export ratio as well as tradable production increased dramatically, meaning that growth spurt created through debt dependence was accompanied by a situation where debt repayment ability of the country declined dramatically during that period. Yeah.
Taking debt, if you take debt servicing as a percentage.
Yeah, I have it as later. But we need both. Debt indicate the long-term impact, right? Debt service mean annual repayment. It's exactly correct. Yeah, it is here, right? Then foreign debt buildup was characterized by two important compositional change. Not only economy became debt dependent and economy became more and more non-tradable dependent, but also there was a big compositional change in debt. Earlier debt was basically bilateral concessional debt, right? But during the Rajapaksa period, there was a shift in the composition of debt from bilateral donors and international development agencies to private borrowing, mostly borrowing by issuing government bonds in the international market. Shifting the source of composition of bilateral debt also shifted from conventional bilateral lenders like US, Canada, UK, and other to China. Right? There was, on the one hand, there was a big shift of total debt from bilateral debt towards private debt. Private sector debt or debt money raised by issuing bonds in capital market is more expensive compared to bilateral lenders giving money to the country, right? Then even within bilateral debt, there was a shift from other conventional lenders, what you call Paris Club members, towards China. China's debt accounted for 70% of bilateral debt in Sri Lanka, and their interest rate was much higher compared to other bilateral lenders. Yeah. Yeah, actually, this another important point. Actually, we are eligible for bilateral debt, but the concession element has declined when the country became a low middle income country. I mean, that's why the Rajapaksa regime had to borrow from the capital market during that period. And then the average interest rate of China debt was much higher. Then eventually, the uh, composition, you can have a look at the diagram later. The blue line here indicate the private borrowing, and then black line indicates international sovereign bond issues. There were about 6 bond issues of billions dollars, which were at an interest rate of about 6 to 7% sometimes, right? And then the concession rate decline as a percentage of total. Now it comes to your point. Yeah, what happened to external debt service burden, right? Then massive debt accumulation and a compositional shift towards expensive sources. Then, as a result of that, debt interest payments relative to government revenue increased to about 70% on this axis, right? That's it. At the eve of when the debt crisis happened, Sri Lanka was paying out of total government expenditure 70% to repay debt and interest payment. You won't believe it, but that's the reality, right? And then out of total export earnings, 35% was paid in order to maintain foreign debt. Look at this. Then, according to the data reported in the World Development Indicator database, Sri Lanka topped the world in terms of both these indicators. Debt to GDP, no, debt service ratio, which is debt repayment and interest payment as a percentage of export earning, debt service ratio, as well as debt to government expenditure ratio. Both these indicators were skyrocketed. They were skyrocketed during this period. Sri Lanka was well above that of other countries during that period. Now, to summarize the story, debt repayment and interest payment accounted for over a third of total earning from goods and services export, and to add to that, government expenditure, out of total expenditure, 70% was absorbed by interest payment, right? And then in this context, actually, IMF gave a clear warning to Sri Lanka in 2019. Your debt is unsustainable. You have to do something about it. But the government ignored that, right? And then there were some other silly government policy during that period. Election came up in 2000, and the government gave a huge tax cut to private sector. All these things worsen the situation, and the country turned out to be vulnerable. That is one side of the coin. In order for a crisis to happen, there has to be a vulnerable situation. Now, this is the story about Sri Lanka's vulnerability. With a huge debt burden and a rapid debt distress at that time. And then what happened? The trigger came, the COVID crisis, then export decline. More importantly, tourist earnings declined dramatically during that period. Earnings from tourism declined from 3.6 billion to about 0.5 billion, right? Then the remittances declined, export contracted, and so on. Eventually, that led to a situation where the growth rate in 2020 was negative 4.6. And Sri Lanka's stellar record of poverty reduction was badly affected, right? The poverty rate increased from about 12% to about 25% in 2022. Even now, out of total population, 25% are below the poverty line. Not like in Kerala, right? Things are very bad actually. Then I think the story is very clear. The country had turned out to be highly vulnerable. Then the trigger came and the crisis happened. The crisis, the most dramatic crisis in Sri Lankan history, right? The dramatic GDP contraction, other indicators also indicate the same pattern. Then what did the government do? IMF has advised, but they thought that that's an easy way of getting IMF credit. IMF has a facility called Rapid Financial Instrument Facility. It helps countries in the event of an impending economic calamity. Then the government went there, but at that time, IMF had already decided that that situation is not sustainable. Therefore, they rejected it. Then the government said, we can manage on our own. We have a homegrown crisis. Then they implemented an ad hoc policy mix. On the other one hand, when the export declined, no reserves, the government imposed draconian import controls. And you'd have seen on TV long queues near petrol station and shops and all that. It led to a big calamity, right? And at that time, India was kind to help with about 3 billion money. That was not enough. I think even we went to Bangladesh to get money, right? Bangladesh lent uh, 200 million. 200 million to Sri Lanka. It was a dramatic situation, right, at that time. Then, 12th April 22, government declared default. There was no other way. Default means it said we are going to continue to pay IMF and World Bank loan, but other loans we stop at that time. When you do that, you are closed from the world capital market. You can't borrow anything and all that. And the economic situation turned out to be even darker. Then the government started negotiating with IMF. This is what Anne Kruger has said at the beginning in the quotation. Say they muddled through for about a year after the COVID shock happened. People suffered massively. There were school teachers who were sharing their meal with children because children come to the classes, they couldn't withstand, they faint and all sort of things. The situation was terrible at that time. Then the government went to IMF and then negotiations started. Then 21st March 2022, 23, they signed the Extended Fund Facility Agreement. Right? And then I think I have taken a long time. Right? Yeah, I'll take another 10 minutes to finish, right? Then what is the IMF fund facility program? Extended, say, IMF is not a long-term lender for development. It's an institute which come to help you to come out of the crisis, right? Then under the IMF program, the IMF gave a special drawing in terms of special drawing rights, 2.2 billion loan, which is roughly comparable to about 3 billion US dollars with repayment in 4 to 10 years, right? 10 years to dispersed in 9 equal installment, and it is not free money. Interest rate is about 5.1%. But the beauty is that 5.1%. Yeah. Yeah, it can increase because that's a formula to calculate it. It varies slightly, but when I did the calculation last night, it was 5.1 interest. Now, in a way, it is reasonable. Not giving cheap money, but the important of the IMF package is the loan comes up with a reform plan, right? It gives the country credibility to implement the reform process. The first 5 installments have been released already, which is about 1.7 billion dispersed, and the next sixth is also going to come in a couple of months' time. Then, so far, the IMF has been very happy. All the installments were released before undertaking an assessment. And the country has so far met the requirement. I don't want to go into detail here. And there was a big political change. The ultra-left in government came into power in December last year. But the government came into power with an election manifesto to change the things and reform, change the IMF programs and so on. But when they came into power, actually the president is intelligent. He realized that there's no way out from the crisis other than going with the IMF. Then IMF managing director gave a phone call to president. She shouted saying, "Bravo, president." Right? It is written somewhere. Say, political change did not result in reversal of the package. Now the government has implemented tax reforms and reduced government expenditure to achieve a primary deficit positive balance of 2.2% of GDP. Primary balance is the difference between government revenue and government current expenditure, right? And then that enable you to repay the debt and so on. And then growth rate has recovered. You can see this data. Yeah.
Growth has slowed down.
No. Say, if you look at here, now the growth rate plummeted to 7.3 negative, but it has gradually returned. Now it is 5%. But you should not read too much meaning to 5 because the denominator is low now, right? Growth is estimated as change in GDP divided by the previous year GDP. Previous year GDP was negative. Therefore,
Recovery.
yeah, it's the recovery. And the IMF predict that after they come out of the crisis, the growth rate is going to be about 3%, right? But inflation came down dramatically. Say the rate of inflation in 1 month in 2022 was 90%. Yeah, salaries had not increased and the real income declined. That's why poverty was also 25%. Now, inflation rate has declined to about 1.5. But again, the government talked very highly about this figure, but it means the inflation, the increase, the private level increases dramatically. From that dramatic level, there has been a slight decline, right? You can see the recovery indicators by looking at comparing 2024 with 23. There has been some recovery, but there hasn't been a massive improvement in foreign reserves, and exports are not still doing very well, and so on. No, the minor current account surplus now. Yeah. Yeah, because import restrictions are still there. They are significantly. Recently, the government removed restrictions on. Yeah. Then
Workers remittance also.
yeah, workers remittance has recovered, and tourism has recovered significantly. All these things have contributed for the country to come out of the depth of the crisis. That is what IMF is concerned. That's why IMF managing director say bravo president. It is. But the picture we have to look at. Pardon?
Which more time would you like?
Yeah, just for 2-3 minutes, right? Then what would be the situation after the IMF program, right? Say, this is the IMF predictions beyond the program. The program ends in 2027. This IMF package program. The IMF predict the growth would be about 3%, not very high, right? This is a big issue as I am good. Inflation will come to about 5%, which is low. But the biggest issue is the debt burden. The role of the IMF package is to help the country to come out of the crisis and access the global credit market. Now, still, government does not have access to credit market, but international credit rating agencies have been upgrading the country situation gradually. Then the IMF expect Sri Lanka to draw 1.5 billion by issuing government bonds in 2027. I mean, in other words, debt overhang continue. The recovery. This is the big problem. Say you can say external debt to GDP ratio would be 59%, right? About 59 billion debt to be repaid. That's why this crisis is different. It's a solvency crisis, not a liquidity crisis. Then I have 5 points here. By 2027, interest payment alone would account to about 4.5% of GDP compared to a primary surplus of 2.3. IMF predict a 2.3 primary surplus, right? The government revenue minus current expenditure, that is the repayment ability indicator. Primary surplus would be about 2.3% of GDP. But debt servicing would be 4.5 according to my calculation, which is a conservative figure. With a large debt stock, heavy interest burden, and sluggish economic growth, which is 3.1%, it is unlikely that the government would be able to access global capital market at a reasonable rate. One indicator which I have used here is that if the government want to enter capital market now, the interest rate for sovereign bond is going to be about 11.5%. Right? Yeah, it's a huge. That's why there is no room for complacency. Right? And yeah. Then dealing. Yeah. Yeah. Then what is the policy challenge beyond the crisis? The point so far is that assuming the program is implemented, IMF is happy and the economy becomes stable, but with a huge debt overhang. And then Sri Lanka is a country that lacks international monetary sovereignty, right? All the debt have been denominated in US dollar mostly. Even if you achieve a primary surplus and create savings in the country, you can't repay that without converting it into dollars, right? Actually, this point, I had an argument with some IMF where they have ignored this important point, right? Given the huge debt overhang with a large share of foreign debt, Sri Lanka therefore face twin challenge of raising sufficient fiscal revenue and then converting them into foreign exchange. In other words, there are two problems: payment problem as well as transfer problem. These are terms from Keynes during the Great Depression time, right? At the same time, given the large debt service burden, the government had to allocate a lot of money for debt servicing, which would be equivalent to about 4%, 5% of GDP, 4.5% of GDP. Then government does not have that much capability to invest money in the country, right? Therefore, government is no longer going to be a growth creator. It is basically a debt repair rather than growth. In this, because of these two problems, on the one hand, you have to manage the debt overhang. On the other hand, government does not have flexibility to promote growth. In that context, future lies in rectifying the non-tradable bias in the economy with the help of the private sector to generate growth. Because you need to repay debt at the same time generate growth, which can happen only if the non-tradable bias which led to the crisis is rectified. That is the biggest problem in the country now. Now, I have analyzed the international experience in detail. So if you look at all the countries which have come out of debt crisis, the success came from export orientation, nothing else, right? Because you had to create debt repayment. At the same time, government can't generate non-tradable related growth like what Rajapaksa's did, right? Therefore, tradable production has to increase. If you look at East Asian countries which came out of the 1997 debt crisis, in all the countries, the success came from export orientation. Now, if does not happen, there are two possibilities. One is further import restrictions, like Sri Lanka did in the 70s, then the economy will shrink. The other one is an ugly alternative. What is it? Going for another IMF agreement, right? And Argentina is now doing it, right? Argentina had a big debt crisis, hands were tied, the government. Now they signed a massive IMF program again for 20 billion. I mean, it's a big country, right? Therefore, if export orientation does not happen and the private sector became more dynamic, Sri Lanka faced two ugly alternatives. One is import restrictions, like in the 70s, or going back to IMF. Actually, IMF has already hinted, if you want, we are going to help, right? Then I'm going to make three concluding remarks and finish. Unprecedented sovereign debt crisis in Sri Lanka was the outcome of perennial vulnerability of the crisis, which was compounded by the debt-driven growth and triggered by the COVID crisis. Sri Lanka's policy challenge is to make the unprecedented economic crisis as the springboard for transforming the twin deficit economy characterized by stop growth cycle into a dynamic outward oriented economy. I think that alternative is open and the government can do it, right? Then this requires combining standard IMF approach to macroeconomic stabilization, which itself is not enough, but it has to combine with structural adjustment reforms to redress the anti-tradable bias in the incentive structure of the country. I'll stop at that time. Sorry, I have taken long time.
Please.
Thank you.
I hope you will all agree with me. It was a fascinating presentation how a country could get into a deep crisis. And if it happens with the help of politics, which he was very kind enough not to stress too much. But we all know who drives the economy, because politics is in command, not economics. Economics follows. So please, so it's open for discussion. Be short in your questions or comments. And if you want to draw some parallel, you can do so. Yes, Professor Virma.
So, as Professor Kannan mentioned, drawing parallel. So, I think in many kind of cases, it is very similar to the situation that we are facing in this state in Kerala, but there is a significant contrast also. So the major similarity is that Kerala and Sri Lanka used to be very similar in terms of the development experience, high human development with even with the low per capita income. So both states emphasized on welfare state, high human development indicators, and also some of those features that you highlighted, the non-tradable sector bias in favor of against tradable and in favor of non-tradable, I think very much is there in Kerala state also, because our traditional export-oriented sectors have experienced a decline. Agriculture declined, and commodity sector as well as the traditional manufacturing export-oriented sector as a share of state GDP has declined. So some of those graphs are very similar, like here. And also there is a debt problem that the government is facing. It's a serious financial issue. The only difference is that since we are we are part of the larger country, we are not facing the same problem that Sri Lanka is facing. That's the only difference. But otherwise, in terms of all other indicators, it's very similar. But since we are part of India, we are not facing the problem because there is no foreign currency crisis. And the other question, that's a comment that I thought I will have. The other thing that many people talk about in Sri Lankan case, the crisis about the role of, the shift towards the emphasis on organic farming, that happened at that time, and the ban on fertilizer, import of fertilizer, which led to a decline in agricultural productivity and further decline in export earnings from agriculture, tea and plantation crops. So that is anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah.
So we will take collected few questions similar.
Yeah.
I agree with Nirmani, but I have a slightly different interpretation for Kerala. And as he rightly said, Kerala is not a sovereign country.
Yeah.
Thank God. Because some of the shocks, external shocks, are absorbed by the country.
Yeah, exactly.
But then your internal debt is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And we have that overhang, if not as much as Sri Lanka, for the state government. There is a big overhang. 22% of the government revenue, total revenue, is in the form of interest payments. Another 22% is in the form of pension payments. So you don't have the revenue for expenditure is just only half of what you get, 56% of what you get. The two others are, you are bound to make these payments for which there is no quid pro quo. Okay? But there's an interesting difference with Sri Lanka. We are not in a societal crisis. In fact, the Kerala private economy is flourishing.
Yeah.
The public economy is starving.
Mm-hmm.
Because the public economy, which is the government economy, government sector, is unable to translate the increase in consumption expenditure into revenue, taxable
Yeah.
income. because the tax to state income ratio is coming down quite fast, which means you are inefficient in your collection.
Right.
You can give any other name, rent seeking, corruption, all kinds of things. For every rupee of, every 100 rupees of state income in Kerala, the government used to collect 12 rupees in the 70s and 80s. That means 12% of the state income was collected as revenue, both tax and non-tax, okay? Own income. Now it is 7.8%. So there is a 35% gap, 35% gap from 12 to less than 8. Okay, therefore the government is buying in order to spend, not spend on capital expenditure, on revenue account.
Yeah.
So of the total debt that the government of Kerala is incurring every year, more than 2/3 is to fill up the revenue deficit, to pay salaries, to pay pensions. Just imagine the social pension, which should be a charge on the Kerala government budget, they cannot meet that. So they ask the cooperative banks to form a consortium, raise some money and give it to the government. The government will pay it back as social pension and provide these banks a rate of interest of 9.5%. So you're borrowing from one section of people and give it to another section of people who are poor. I will be eminently, approving of this if only instead of taking loan, if they had collected the amount as taxes. Then there is no payment of interest for this particular one. But another big difference with Sri Lanka, I was a bit surprised that Sri Lanka's remittance income is only 3% of its GDP.
Yeah.
In Kerala, it is 17 to 18 to 19%, which is a very big share.
Yeah.
So in a way, Kerala's high consumption is financed by its own people. What Professor Virmani in his earlier exercise did, that he didn't count the remittance as an export income. So if you really broaden the concept of export, just as you export spices, you also export labor services. And for both, you get foreign exchange. So all the income that you get as foreign exchange by way of export is your income. Export, any foreign exchange income. So that is a major factor in Kerala. Private economy is doing well because the banks are flush with money. The non-resident deposits. The luxury goods in the Indian manufacturing sector has a very good market in Kerala. 25% of the households in Kerala own at least one car. The national average is 7%. 80% of the households in Kerala, they have a fridge. The national average is 35%. So how does this consumption of what we would like to call luxuries, they are not necessities and can't be afforded by ordinary people because these remittances finance these things. And if only you export more people. If only you export more people, your remittance income will come and help you somewhat. So we have a similar story as far as government finance is concerned, but a slightly different one when it comes to private economy. Yes. Thank you. Please, anybody else?
Yes, sir. So
introduce yourself. That would be good.
Sir, I'm Hamid and I'm a first year MA student here in CDS. So one of the primary reasons of Sri Lanka's vulnerability is persistent government deficit. So I would like to kind of ask the question, like, how much did military spending, because Kerala has had since the 1970s has had abnormally high military spending. So how much of that contributed in creating this vulnerability and the subsequent crisis? That's all, sir.
when we try to draw lessons from Sri Lanka, it's important to mention the carelessness in your macro situation, overall macro situation is taken care of by the central government, right? That's important. But when you talk about the growth process in the country, budgetary management matters, as Professor Kannan correctly pointed out. Say in Sri Lanka, because of the time limit, I did not cover everything. One of the reasons which made the crisis aggravated was that tax revenue to GDP ratio declined dramatically. I think improving tax base is very important in order to give leverage for the government to implement development policy. It's a similar story. Say during the colonial period and the first 2 decades, the government could tax exports, right? And then imports also tax through import controls and various things. Therefore, the revenue base was basically dependent on foreign trade Sri Lanka. Then liberalization came, import duties were removed and all that. Therefore, the indirect tax base narrowed. But to compensate for that, there was no government effort to improve direct taxation. Say, here the income levels have increased because of remittance and so on. I think there's plenty of opportunities to increase direct taxation. That is one of the lessons maybe from Sri Lanka. Even though you are a state, and still there is plenty of opportunities to improve the incentive structure in the country, right? Say one of the issues raised by the international community is that Kerala has the best human capital base in this country compared to other states. Why foreign investors are not coming to labor-intensive manufacturing sector? There can be issues relating to foreign investment approval procedures, as well as the strong hand of the trade unions. I don't know whether it's true. And this morning you pointed out a very important factor, the restrictions related to land use, right? Say, you need to give opportunity for landowners to select what type of crops to be grown, right? But the government restriction prevent paddy land moving to other sectors, and tea land diversifying to other crops, right? All these restrictions are exactly similar to that in Sri Lanka.
Which are the major export items?
Now apparel and the manufactured goods, apparel and tires and all this, thanks to the reform process. I think still Kerala has opportunities to undertake reforms. And as Professor Khan mentioned, people are happy, income levels are higher because of the safe valve created by migration. But I mean, using your manpower to develop the country is the challenge. Not relying on your people going overseas to help your country. I mean, that is what is happening. If you take Japan as example, during the pre-war period, Japan was a big labor exporter. You would have heard about Nikkeian, people going to Latin America to work. When the country developed, labor has come back. Say most of the Nikkeians have shifted from Latin America to Japan. Malaysia was a labor exporter earlier. But now, out of total labor force in manufacturing, more than 30% are foreign workers. They are importing workers. I think rectifying the incentive structure to retain your manpower rather than just promoting out migration should be government priority if you want to uplift. Otherwise, the country, as you correctly pointed out, would be in a remittance trap. You depend on remittances and people are happier, but you are not moving now. Now, your point about fertilizer subsidy, it is true, it added to vulnerability It was just a dot in the whole story, even though Kaushik Basu has highlighted this as a main factor. Right? Say, our president at that time, a little bit like of this, similarly, the crisis happened. In the crisis context, he wanted to shift agriculture from organic, inorganic to organic. And he had advised a medical doctor, he didn't know much about economics or anything. He advised him to stop importing inorganic fertilizer.
Employed to compress imports.
Yeah, but you could have done it gradually. Again, in a crisis context, you should not do it. But eventually, farmers, planters retaliated. Eventually, it was removed. It lasted only for about 3 months, but the impact lingered on for about a year. The rice harvest turned out to be low. And it was a silly step taken in a crisis context. But it was just a dot in the overall process. Your question is very important. Say, Sri Lanka implemented significant economic reforms in 1977. Then the economy started picking up. Even big multinationals like Motorola, Harris Corporation, they thought that Sri Lanka would be an ideal place for electronic production and all that. Therefore, during the first few years, the economy was booming. Then the crisis, the conflict happened. The military expenditure as a percentage of GDP increased to about 7% during that period. It was one of the constraints in the growth. But then the war ended in 2009. My story relates after that period. Say, war ended, peace came to the country. At the same time, military burden was reduced significantly. Then that was good opportunity for the country to continue with reform. It did not happen. Then that's another deep answer. Actually, ethnic uprising, mainly it happened because of poor performing in the economy. Tamil people were very peaceful people. Most of the Jaffna people found livelihood in the south. Our doctors in our village were Tamil, right? The shopkeepers were Tamil. Country remained nicely integrated. Then what happened was, because of wrong policies, economy started shrinking. Then the government turned out to be the major employer. And when it comes to allocating government jobs, Tamils got discriminated against, right? Then Jaffna families spend a lot of money from children education. The pass rate at the HSC, university entry level, is much higher in Jaffna compared to rest of the country. Then their target was to send their children to university and make professional. But the economic budget shrank, university capabilities reduced, and the government imposed quotas for university entry. It provided breeding ground for Prabhakaran. Bright people complete in HSC who can't get into the universities, they joined him, right? In other words, part of the reason, I think the major part of the reason for the economic crisis was economics as well. If they
the flight of Tamil population also affected the economy.
To some extent.
Tamil.
Yeah, of course.
So that created also a...
Yeah, it affected, but in the after world civil war situation, these people could have contributed to growth, right?
But 7% is a very high for defense purpose.
Yeah.
And most governments also conceal some of the expenditure.
Yeah.
The real one could be much more than...
Yeah.
So that is the major...
Yeah. But that's another ugly story. One of the reasons why poverty declined during that period is that actually the rich people do not send their children to war, right?
The army.
Army. poor people from villages. I'm a villager, right? Lot of poor people, children join the army, right? When somebody get killed, then the government support the family. And you can see new houses built because of these war calamities. Yeah, that's a bad thing, right? But that's reality. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm.
More? Yeah.
I'm from R-. I'm a second year student in analytical economics.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, you said one of the reasons why Sri Lanka faced a debt crisis, number one, the major one, but the reason was debt financed infrastructure development, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but look at the Chinese example. During the latest five-year plan, we had as a huge road network, which is a yes, which if we took real terms, the entire road network could cover from Kashmir to Kanyakumari 50 times.
Yeah.
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 So that is the level of road infrastructure development that they built.
Yeah.
And most of it was financed through debt.
Yeah.
And we also know that the Chinese officials are also corrupt because we can see that most of their spending is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is different in China's case and how is different in Sri Lanka's case?
Right, good question. Now, in this case, when you talk about one element of the policy package, actually you have to assess in the context of the overall development strategy. Now, look at China. China growth remains subdued under the communist regime, right? Then President Deng Xiaoping started opening the economy. Do you know, he got the ideas for opening the economy from Singapore. That's a big biography written about Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping visited Singapore and had a long session with Lee Kuan Yew. Then after the session, he said, now I understand blaming the market is not the way. We can use the market for reform, but we can't do China in Singapore in China. Singapore is a tiny island. China is virtually a continent. He says, but what I am going to do is to open up the coastal areas for foreign direct investment, right? Say, then there was a sound program to open up free trade zone in the coastal areas. Then to complement it, government implemented infrastructure development process. At the same time, China's central bank started macroeconomic management to make export orientation viable in that country. More importantly, it's a communist country. The government brought stability to the country, which is lacking in the way in China. Government say in India, the government has to take into account voters' ideas and all that all the time. In China, the dictatorial government can plan ahead in their own way without all these things contributed towards the massive economic rise in China, right? It became the biggest exporting nation in the world, second biggest country, and all sort of things. Within that context, infrastructure played a role, right? There's a new book written by a journalist called Breakneck. You can do a Google search. According to this book, China's infrastructure strategy was amazing, right? Because of it came as part of the overall package. Well, on the one hand, revenue increase from export orientation and all that. The government used that vigilantly to develop the road network. That is China's story. Look at Sri Lanka. After the civil war, naturally there was a reason to develop infrastructure. Road network to Jaffna had been damaged significantly. Railway line was destroyed by the boys and all sorts of things, right? But what Rajapaksa did was to focus entirely on infrastructure not because of infrastructure need. At the same time, infrastructure help giving contracts to your supporters and all that. That's what I said. One of the big road could have paid with gold. I mean, this is an exaggerate. But while doing infrastructure investment, he ignored other policies. Actually, even with the war going on, Sri Lankan export processing zone had been very successful. We became one of the leading apparel exporter in the world. We became the largest heavy-duty tire exporter in the world. All these things happened while the war is in the north part. Then foreign investment played a key role. Then the government distorted the foreign investment regime. No significant foreign investor has come to Sri Lanka from 2009 to present day. And Koreans were the biggest investor in the country. All Korean factories closed down because the government came up with draconian labor legislation. Then I have written this story about the Japanese company, which was doing very well, and then the strikes destroyed that company. Now, Japanese won't come to Sri Lanka, would not come to Sri Lanka unless the labor law is reformed. All these problems happen. In a nutshell, the answer is infrastructure did not work and it contributed to crisis simply because it was just an appendage to a highly distorted investment regime, right? Highly distorted investment regime. And then investment regime did not create sufficient growth to meet tradable production increase to repay the debt. If you look at China, China has the second largest foreign reserves next to Germany, right? About 5 trillion, right? The strong economy. But Sri Lanka, it was not the case because the export-oriented industries shrunk. Therefore, the balance of payment deteriorated. Eventually, the country became susceptible to the crisis. Then the biggest lesson is that when you talk about development strategy, you need to consider the overall package together, not one basic element. To give a draconian example, highest investment by a government was in Mobutu Zaire in the 60s. What happened to Zaire, which is Congo, right? Because he was using government money to build roadwork to his village, buying planes to support his own families and all sorts of things. Investment happened, but it will not create the growth if it is built into a proper development strategy. Thank you.
I think we are, time is up.
Yeah.
If you have any doubts, he'll be available after the.
Yeah, and you can see my email address here. If you have any question, you can send me an email.
The audience is also filling. So thank you all
Yeah.
for your very patience. Attention.
Mhm.
Lovely thanks for our excellent lecture. Thank you.
Just take one
Yeah.
announcement, just one announcement.
Oh, okay.
We thought that this is the appropriate time to make this announcement. This is a new initiative from CDS. So from this year onwards, very recently, we put it out on our website. So as part of our capacity building initiatives with colleges and universities in Kerala, we have announced the KN Raj CDS Research Fellowship. So this is basically for the college teachers and faculty members in universities and colleges in Kerala to collaborate with the CDS faculty on a joint paper. So we support their travel, their stay, and also give generous honorarium once they complete their paper. And it will be a joint paper, not just like they come and do whatever the CDS faculty write it to, or they are a co-author of the paper, and they have to apply with a proposal, and if the faculty find it suitable, then they select and then complete the paper, make a presentation here at the seminar, and also publish it as a joint paper as a CDS work in the CDS working paper series. So this is the announcement, and I thought that we'll make it. So encourage people to apply for this.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Very nice evening.
Yeah, you are good. I think I took thinking about long, but we started a little late.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like part of the game.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we'll communicate through email.